The first time I saw a man eaten alive, I was only 13. It was in the king's courtyard, under the scorching sun. The man screamed, his body thrashing as the hyenas tore into him. The crowd was silent. No one dared look away. Not when King Obadele was watching. Not when his executioners stood with their spears, waiting for anyone foolish enough to show pity. Our king was not like others. He did not believe in prisons. He did not believe in mercy. If you stole, you died. If you spoke against him, you died. If you were too weak to walk, you died. And the death was never quick. The fear of his cruel punishment clung to us like a shadow, following us even in the quiet of our homes. I lived in the palace, though not by choice. My father was the king's herbalist. That meant we lived close to power, close to danger. I remember the heavy scent of herbs mixed with the stench of fear in the air. I saw things that still haunt my dreams. I saw men and women dragged away in the night, their faces pale as they waited for their fate. I saw people buried up to their necks while fire ants crawled over their faces. I saw mothers forced to watch their children disappear into the king's pit of wild dogs. The cruelty did not stop there. King Obadele's punishments were meant to remind everyone that his word was law. He would wander the streets of his palace like a dark cloud. I often hid behind pillars when his guards marched by. I listened to hushed voices discussing the horrors of the day and prayed silently for a time when the king's rage would end. But nothing compared to the night of the full moon. The night my father betrayed the king. I woke up to whispers in the dark. In the small room where my family slept, my father, my mother, and 2 elders from the village huddled together. Their faces were drawn with worry. The moonlight through the window made their eyes look even more fearful. It must end, one of the elders said in a trembling voice. Too much blood has been spilled. My father's nod was slow and determined. Tomorrow, I will do it, he said. I did not understand every word, but the weight of his decision pressed down on me like a heavy cloak. That morning, I watched my father prepare something behind closed doors. He walked quickly and quietly. I remember the way his hands shook as he mixed bitter herbs with a strange powder. He soaked the king's drinking cup in the potion. I later learned that it was meant to end the king's life. But fate is cruel. That same afternoon, before the king could drink, his chief guard collapsed in a heap near the great hall, foam trickling from his mouth. The poison was meant for the king, but somehow it found another target. What happened next turned the palace into a scene of chaos. The air filled with the sound of panicked screams and clashing feet. Soldiers stormed the corridors, dragging my father by his arms. My mother, desperate and pleading, tried to stop them. I remember her tears as they took her away. And then, they came for me. That night, in the cold and dim light of the great hall, I knelt before King Obadele. His face was calm, his eyes as dark as the river at midnight. Your father has offended the gods, he said. His voice was steady and unyielding. And so, the gods must be fed. I did not understand his words then. I only felt the heavy grip of terror as the guards brought in a large cauldron. I was forced to watch, unable to look away, as they placed my father into it. The water began to boil, and my father's screams echoed in the stone hall. The sound of his pain, the smell of burning flesh, and the sight of his terror are things I will never forget. The cauldron's heat burned my skin as the reality of that moment sank in. And my mother. I never saw her again. The king let me live. He said I was a reminder of what happens to traitors. I was left with nothing but my memories and a deep-seated fear that would follow me for the rest of my days. Years passed after that day, and the kingdom remained under King Obadele's iron fist. I grew up in the palace, always in the background, my eyes wide with terror and sorrow. I was forced to serve him in small ways, a constant reminder of the cost of defiance. Each day, I watched the people of the kingdom shrink back in fear, their smiles replaced by sorrowful resignation. But whispers of change started in the shadows. People talked of a time when the king's cruelty would be over. The common folk gathered in secret meetings by the river, their voices low as they shared their dreams of freedom. Even some of the soldiers began to question the endless violence. I heard rumors that some guards could not bear the sight of the suffering any longer. In hushed tones, they admitted that the man they once followed without question had become a monster. I tried to stay out of these talks, afraid that even a whisper could bring down the wrath of the king. Yet, the hope of change was a seed that had been planted in the hearts of many. It grew slowly, nurtured by the shared pain of loss and the silent wish for a kinder world. The turning point came during a heavy rainstorm. The night was dark and cold, the wind howling through the palace walls like a mournful cry. I remember how the rain hammered on the roofs and how the corridors seemed to stretch longer than ever. It was then that the rebellion began in earnest. I was hidden away in one of the palace's forgotten corridors when I heard the clamor of boots and the clash of steel. The rebel soldiers, many of whom had once been among the king's loyal guards, had gathered. They whispered that tonight, the time had come to end the reign of terror. I crept from my hiding place and watched in silent horror as the hallways turned into battlefields. The sound of swords clashing, the cry of men, and the smell of blood filled every corner. I knew it was dangerous, but I had to see what was happening. Somewhere in the chaos, King Obadele was still alive, clinging to his power. After what felt like hours of fighting, I finally found myself in the great hall, the very same hall where I had once knelt in terror. The vast room was now in disarray. Broken furniture lay scattered on the floor, and banners that once spoke of royal glory were torn and stained. At the far end of the hall, behind a heavy wooden door, I could see a faint light. I knew the king would not leave his chamber willingly. I joined a small group of rebels who had gathered near the hall's entrance. Their faces were lined with determination and grief. They had lost much to the king's cruelty, and tonight they had come to reclaim their future. One man, a quiet soldier with kind eyes who called himself Ikon, led us. His voice was soft but firm as he said, "This is the night we free our people. King Obadele must pay for all that he has done." The door creaked as it was forced open. Inside, the room was dim and smoky from the earlier fires. King Obadele stood near a grand window, his back turned to us as if he were waiting for a servant. For a moment, I saw him as he had always been, a figure of power. But as he turned slowly, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. It was a look I had never seen before. The rebels closed in. Some of his old guards, now hardened by cruelty and regret, looked on with conflicted expressions. The king tried to speak, his voice hoarse. "You will not do this. I am your ruler. I have kept order in this land." But his words fell on deaf ears. A woman named Nia, one of the rebel leaders, stepped forward. Her face was marked by scars and sorrow, but her eyes shone with a fierce light. "Order," she spat. "Your order has been built on the screams of the innocent. Your reign ends tonight." The room exploded into a fierce struggle. I saw Ikon move swiftly through the chaos, his sword glinting in the flickering light. King Obadele ran, his robes trailing behind him as he darted between columns and shattered relics of a bygone era. The sound of his heavy breathing mixed with the pounding of our footsteps. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding in my ears. The corridors of the palace, once filled with the sound of the king's commands, now echoed with the clash of rebellion. I could hear shouts and the crash of falling debris as the building seemed to come apart around us. In one of the long corridors, I saw him again. King Obadele was trapped. The wall behind him had collapsed, leaving him with no way to run. His eyes were wide, and for a moment, I saw not a tyrant, but a man facing the end. A guard who had once followed him loyally now hesitated, his face torn between duty and the desire for redemption. It was then that Ikon emerged from the shadows. With a steady hand, he approached the king. The room fell silent as the two faced each other. The king tried to speak, his voice trembling. "I have done what must be done to keep our land in order." Ikon's voice was calm and clear. "Order built on fear is no order at all." In that moment, the weight of all the suffering, the countless lives lost, pressed down upon the room. A single, swift movement, and Ikon struck. I saw the flash of a blade, the drop of blood that marked the end of a reign. King Obadele staggered, a look of shock and regret in his eyes. He fell to the cold stone floor, his long life coming to an abrupt end. The hall was silent after the final blow. I remember the soft echo of the king's last breath, a weak sound, swallowed by the darkness of that night. For many in the room, there was a mix of relief and sorrow. The man who had ruled with terror was finally dead. But for me, the memory of that moment, of the betrayal, and the loss of my family, would never fade. In the days that followed, the palace was filled with both hope and mourning. The people slowly emerged from the shadows of fear, stepping into a light that had long been denied to them. The rebel leaders took over the throne, promising a new start, a time when justice would replace cruelty. I was given a small corner in the new world, but the scars of my past were always there. I often wonder about the path that led to that fateful night. My father had risked everything to end the king's tyranny. My mother had paid the ultimate price for her hope. And I, left behind as a silent witness, carried the burden of that history in my heart. Sometimes, when the night is still and the wind whispers through the broken walls of the palace, I think I can still hear King Obadele's voice, a low, haunting sound that reminds me of the suffering he once caused. I see his shadow in the flicker of candlelight and feel the weight of every life taken in his name. But even in death, the memory of his cruelty has a way of living on. I have learned that true justice is slow and hard-won. The people of our land now speak of a time before terror, a time when fear ruled the streets and hope was a distant memory. They speak of my father, of the brave souls who dared to rise against the monster, and of the night when the wicked king fell. King Obadele's death was not the work of the gods or a sudden curse, it was the result of years of suffering, of a people who refused to live in fear any longer. It was a hard, bloody fight fought in the darkness of a stormy night, when every cry for freedom was a step towards ending his cruel legacy. His end came at the hands of those who had suffered, of soldiers and villagers alike, united by the shared desire to see an end to the endless night of tyranny. Even now, I sometimes hear the whispers of those lost souls. Their voices, carried by the wind through the empty halls of the old palace, remind me that every act of cruelty leaves a mark on the world. And though the wicked king is gone, the lessons of his rule remain with us all. The gods were fed that night, but their hunger was not sated. The price of power, the heavy toll of cruelty, has a way of coming back to haunt you. And as long as I live, I will remember the terror, the betrayal, and the slow, painful end of King Obadele, a man whose fall marked the birth of a new day for our suffering land. Thank you for watching. Please do well to like, comment, share and don't forget to subscribe for more interesting stories like this.